People like you don't belong at this table." The words landed clean and cold, cutting through the soft hum of a $2,000 per plate dinner like a blade through silk. Crystal glasses paused midair. A violinist in the corner missed a note. Every eye turned, not to the man who spoke, but to the woman he had chosen to diminish. Angela Brooks stood at the edge of the table, her posture steady, her expression unreadable, a single drop of red wine sliding slowly down the stem of her glass, catching the amber glow of the chandelier above. Richard Coleman leaned back in his chair, cufflinks flashing under the light, a faint smile curling at the edge of his mouth as if the room itself existed for his approval. Around him sat investors, executives, names that moved markets and headlines, all dressed in tailored confidence, all watching to see what would happen next. Angela did not rush to respond. She didn't defend herself. She didn't shrink. Instead, she placed her glass down with quiet precision, the soft click against the white linen louder than it should have been, like a signal no one could quite interpret. The scent of aged bourbon and truffle oil lingered in the air, thick and expensive, but beneath it, something else settled in. Tension, sharp and electric. Richard's gaze stayed fixed on her, waiting, expecting discomfort, apology, something that would confirm the role he had assigned her in his mind. But Angela's eyes moved instead, not to him, but across the table, reading the room, measuring silence the way others measured profit margins. A few guests shifted in their seats. One man adjusted his tie, another cleared his throat, but said nothing. The power in the room felt absolute, but it also felt fragile, like glass stretched too thin. Angela reached into her bag slowly, deliberately, every movement controlled, every second stretching just enough to make the room lean forward without realizing it. No one spoke. Even the waitstaff seemed to pause at the edges of the room, trays hovering, breath held. Richard's smile tightened, just slightly, the first crack in a performance he had perfected over years of being the loudest voice in every room. Angela withdrew a single envelope, plain, unmarked, and placed it gently on the table in front of him, aligning it perfectly with the edge of his plate. The paper looked ordinary, almost insignificant against the polished silverware and imported porcelain, yet somehow it drew more attention than anything else in the room. She didn't explain it. She didn't gesture. She simply let it sit there, untouched, as if it had always belonged. The silence deepened, pressing in from all sides. Somewhere in the distance, a glass clinked faintly, out of rhythm, out of place. Richard glanced down at the envelope, then back at her, his expression unreadable now, curiosity replacing certainty, if only by a fraction. Angela met his gaze for just a moment, calm, unwavering, then stepped back from the table, giving the space back to him, but not the control. And in that brief, suspended moment, before anyone reached for the envelope, before any truth had been spoken out loud, the entire room seemed to understand that something had already shifted, something irreversible, something that no amount of wealth or authority could quietly undo. No one reached for the envelope at first. It sat there between the polished silver fork and the untouched steak, quiet and patient, as if it had all the time in the world. Richard's fingers rested on the edge of the table, unmoving, but the rhythm beneath his cuff betrayed him, a subtle pulse, faster than before. Across from him, a woman in a navy dress leaned slightly toward her husband, whispering something that never quite formed into sound. The room had not resumed its conversation. It had not recovered. It was waiting. Angela had already stepped back, her presence no longer centered at the table, yet somehow more dominant than anyone seated. She moved with measured calm toward the far side of the room, near a tall window that framed the city skyline, 50 stories below, lights stretching out like a map of quiet power. From there, she watched without appearing to watch, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing even, as if she had done this before, as if this moment was not an accident but a choice. Richard finally shifted. His hand moved, slow at first, then more deliberate, as he placed his fingertips on the envelope. The paper was heavier than it looked. He noticed that immediately. Not decorative, not embossed, but intentional. He slid it an inch closer, the sound barely audible, yet somehow it echoed. Someone cleared their throat. Another guest adjusted their chair, the legs scraping softly against the floor. Still no one spoke. Richard glanced up once more, toward Angela, but she did not meet his eyes this time. She was looking out at the city, as if the outcome had already been decided and no longer required her attention. That unsettled him more than anything. Slowly, he opened the envelope. The seal gave way with a soft tear, clean and final. He pulled out a single document, folded once. His eyes scanned the first line, then stopped. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a pause, a fraction longer than expected. Then his jaw tightened. The color in his face shifted, not fading, not flushing, but recalibrating, like something inside him was trying to catch up to what he was reading. The man seated to his right leaned slightly, attempting to glimpse the page, but Richard angled it away instinctively. A reflex. Control. Yet the control felt thinner now. Fragile. The document did not look complex. No dense paragraphs, no overwhelming legal jargon. Just names, percentages, signatures. Clear. Direct. Unavoidable. Richard's thumb pressed harder against the edge of the paper, leaving a faint crease. He read the line again. And again. Around the table, the air felt different. Heavier. Not tense in the same way as before, but charged with something quieter, more dangerous. Recognition. A realization moving silently from one person to another, even without seeing the page. Because they all understood one thing. Whatever was in that envelope had changed the balance. Completely. Richard lowered the paper slightly, just enough to let his eyes lift again. This time, when he looked across the room, Angela had turned back. Their eyes met, and in that brief connection, there was no challenge in her expression, no anger, no satisfaction. Only certainty. The kind that does not need to announce itself. The kind that simply exists. Richard exhaled, though he had not realized he had been holding his breath. The faint smile he had worn earlier was gone now, replaced by something far less certain, something almost unfamiliar. And for the first time that evening, the man who controlled the room was no longer the one defining it. The paper did not shake in Richard's hand, but everything else did. Not visibly, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough that the man who prided himself on absolute control could feel it slipping, inch by inch, like sand through a closed fist. He read the name again, slower this time, as if changing the pace might somehow change the meaning. Angela Brooks. Not listed as a guest, not as an assistant, not even as a minor stakeholder. Primary capital holder. The word sat there, unblinking, immune to interpretation. Across the table, one of the senior partners leaned forward, his voice low but no longer cautious. Richard, is that what I think it is? No one laughed this time. No one shifted to fill the silence. The question hung in the air, unanswered, because the answer was already visible in Richard's expression. His eyes lifted again, searching for something to anchor to, but the room no longer offered it. The familiar hierarchy had dissolved. The invisible lines that once defined who spoke and who listened had blurred beyond recognition. Angela took a slow step away from the window, the soft sound of her heels against the marble floor drawing attention without asking for it. She did not rush back to the table. She did not reclaim a seat. She simply moved closer, enough to be seen clearly, enough to remind everyone that she had never truly left the center of the moment. The city lights behind her framed her silhouette, steady and grounded, as if the entire skyline had aligned itself to witness what was unfolding. Richard placed the document back on the table, but his hand lingered on it, fingertips pressing down slightly, as if confirming it was real. "This is a mistake," he said finally, his voice controlled, but thinner than before, lacking the weight it carried just minutes earlier. The words did not land the way he intended. They did not. Command agreement. They sounded like a question disguised as certainty. Angela tilted her head slightly, not in challenge, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if she had expected that response. "It is not," she said, her voice even, measured, the kind that does not need volume to be heard. A few heads turned toward her fully now, no longer pretending neutrality, no longer hiding curiosity. One of the investors reached for his own folder, flipping pages quickly, searching, cross-referencing, trying to catch up to a reality that had shifted without permission. The room, once orchestrated around Richard's presence, now moved in fragmented reactions, each person recalibrating their understanding of who held the true weight in the deal. Richard exhaled slowly, then leaned back in his chair, creating distance between himself and the document, as if physical space might restore some form of authority. But distance only made it clearer. The envelope, the paper, the name, they were all still there. Unchanged. Unmovable. His gaze drifted across the table, but no one met it with the same certainty as before. The subtle nods, the quiet affirmations, the unspoken alignment that once followed his lead had vanished. In their place was something else. Hesitation. Evaluation. And then, almost imperceptibly, recognition. Angela rested her hand lightly on the back of an empty chair, her posture relaxed, her presence undeniable. She did not need to claim the room. It was already shifting toward her. And in that slow, undeniable shift, Richard understood something he had never had to consider before. The power he thought he held was never absolute. It had simply never been challenged by the right person, at the right moment, in the right way. The silence did not break. It stretched, thin and fragile, like a thread pulled too far, but not yet snapped. Richard's fingers tapped once against the table, a habit he had never noticed until now, the sound sharper than it should have been in a room this controlled. No one interrupted him. No one stepped in to restore order. That, more than anything, unsettled him. He leaned forward again, slower this time, his eyes returning to the document as if it might rearrange itself under pressure, as if numbers and names could be negotiated simply by refusing to accept them. They did not. Across from him, one of the senior investors finally spoke, his tone no longer deferential, no longer waiting for permission. If she holds that percentage, then she is not just involved in this deal, she defines it. The statement did not echo, but it landed with weight, shifting attention fully, decisively. A few heads nodded, subtle but undeniable. Someone else reached for a tablet, scrolling quickly, verifying ownership structures, tracing capital flows, connecting dots that had been hidden in plain sight. The truth was not emerging. It had already been there. They were only now choosing to see it. Angela stepped closer to the table, not reclaiming a seat, not asking for space, simply existing within it with a quiet authority that did not need to be announced. The soft light caught along the edge of her sleeve, the fabric simple but precise, every detail intentional in a way that no one had noticed before. Richard watched her now without speaking, his earlier certainty replaced by calculation, by the instinct to regain footing, to reframe the narrative before it fully escaped him. If this is accurate, he began, his voice measured, rebuilding itself word by word, then it should have been disclosed earlier. It sounded structured. It sounded logical. It almost sounded like control. But even as he spoke, the room did not realign behind him. Angela met his words with stillness, not resistance, not agreement, just presence. It was disclosed, she said calmly. No emphasis, no defense, just fact. A few people exchanged glances. One of the legal advisors adjusted his glasses, flipping through digital notes, his expression tightening as confirmation surfaced on his screen. A timestamp, a filing, a signature, not hidden, not missing, simply overlooked or ignored. The realization moved quietly but completely. Richard's jaw set slightly, the smallest visible sign of pressure building beneath the surface. He shifted in his chair again, but this time the movement felt less like control and more like adjustment, like someone trying to find balance on ground that no longer held firm. Angela rested her hand lightly on the table now, not claiming ownership, but grounding the moment, anchoring it. The distance between them had closed, but the space felt wider than before, filled with everything that had not been said earlier, everything that had been assumed without question. The room was no longer waiting for Richard to speak. It was waiting for what came next from her. And that shift, quiet but absolute, changed everything. For the first time that evening, Richard did not respond immediately. He looked at her, really looked this time, not at her clothes, not at her place at the table, but at her. And in that moment, something settled in his expression, not acceptance, not yet, but recognition. Not of her position, of his mistake. The room no longer felt like a place of celebration. The candles still burned, the glasses still shimmered, but the warmth had drained from the air, replaced by something sharper, more exacting. Richard straightened in his chair, shoulders pulling back as if posture alone could restore what had already slipped beyond reach. His voice came again, more deliberate now, measured down to each syllable. Even if your position is as stated, There are protocols. There are expectations in how these matters are handled. It sounded like structure. It sounded like order. But beneath it, there was strain. Angela did not respond immediately. Her hand remained lightly against the table, fingers relaxed, as if she were feeling the surface rather than claiming it. She let the silence answer first. Around them, the others had stopped pretending neutrality. A man near the end of the table leaned forward, elbows resting on linen, his attention no longer divided. A woman beside him closed her folder completely, no longer interested in the prepared agenda. What had been scheduled for the evening had already lost its relevance. Angela finally spoke, her tone steady, almost quiet, yet it carried with clarity that did not need reinforcement. Expectations depend on who is being expected to speak, she said. No edge, no accusation, just a statement that settled into the space with precision. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation, searching for a way to reposition, to redirect. He reached for his glass, lifting it halfway before setting it back down untouched. The movement was small, but noticeable, controlled, but not natural. Across the table, one of the analysts spoke up, more confident than before, emboldened by the shifting balance. Her capital secures over 40% of the deal, he said, glancing briefly at his notes before continuing. Without that, the structure collapses. The words did not echo, but they landed with finality. 40%. It was not just influence. It was foundation. Richard's jaw tightened again, the smallest reaction, but this time it did not go unnoticed. A few eyes flicked toward him, not in support, but in assessment. The room was no longer aligned. It was evaluating. Angela took another step closer, now fully within the circle of the table, yet still without sitting. Her presence did not demand space. It redefined it. I was here to listen, she said, her gaze moving briefly across the others, acknowledging them without lingering. To understand how you intended to move forward. She paused, just long enough for the weight of that to settle, before deciding if I would remain part of it. The shift was immediate. Not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. A few people exchanged looks, subtle but unmistakable. The power dynamic had not just changed. It had inverted. Richard leaned forward again, this time not to dominate the space, but to hold on to it. You were suggesting that you would walk away from this? He asked. The question was controlled, but the undertone was not. It carried something new. Uncertainty. Angela met his gaze fully now, her expression calm, unshaken. I am suggesting that I choose where my capital stands, she replied. The words were simple, but they landed deeper than anything spoken so far. Around the table, no one interrupted. No one laughed. No one dismissed it, because they understood what it meant. This was no longer about a seat at the table. It was about who had the power to decide if the table existed at all. Richard sat back slowly, the movement, deliberate, but this time it did not restore his presence. It exposed the distance between what he had believed and what was now undeniable. The man who had entered the room in control was still sitting there, but the control itself had already moved on. The room settled into a stillness that felt heavier than silence, as if every person present had stepped back internally, recalculating their position without moving an inch. The faint hum of the city outside pressed softly against the glass walls, distant and indifferent, while inside, time seemed to stretch between each breath. Richard did not speak. Not immediately. His hands rested flat against the table now, no longer tapping, no longer reaching, just still, as if motion itself might betray him. The document remained where he had left it, its edges perfectly aligned, its presence undeniable. Angela did not press further. She did not repeat herself. She simply stood there, composed, allowing the weight of her words to exist without reinforcement. That restraint carried more authority than any argument could have. A server stepped quietly into the room, pausing near the doorway, uncertain whether to continue with the next course. No one acknowledged him. The choreography of the evening had been interrupted, and no one seemed willing to resume it without knowing who now led the rhythm. One of the older investors leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose, his eyes fixed not on Richard, but on Angela, studying her with a new kind of attention, one that did not measure appearance, but presence. Another guest folded his hands together, elbows on the table, his posture no longer relaxed, but attentive, as if waiting for a signal that had not yet been given. Angela shifted her weight slightly, the movement minimal, but enough to catch the light differently across her face. There was no triumph there, no satisfaction, only a quiet steadiness, the kind that came from knowing exactly where she stood long before anyone else realized it. Richard finally lifted his gaze again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if each second gave him a chance to rebuild something internally before facing what was in front of him. His voice, when it came, was lower, stripped of the sharp edge it carried earlier. "You could have said something sooner," he said. It was not an accusation. Not entirely. It sounded closer to a question, though he did not frame it that way. Angela considered him for a brief moment, her expression unchanged. "You were not listening," she replied. The words were simple, almost quiet, but they landed with a clarity that did not leave room for reinterpretation. A subtle shift moved through the room, not visible, but felt, as if that sentence had connected something that had been floating unresolved. Richard's lips pressed together, the smallest sign of resistance, but it faded quickly, replaced by something else. Recognition, again, but deeper this time, less defensive. He glanced down at the table, at the untouched plate, the glass he had not lifted, the document that had altered everything. And for a moment, the environment he had curated so carefully no longer felt like an extension of his control, but like a stage where he had misread the script. Angela took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling almost imperceptibly, grounding herself in the stillness rather than pushing against it. The others watched, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of understanding that they were witnessing a shift that would extend beyond this room, beyond this evening. No one reached for their phones. No one attempted to interrupt. The moment demanded presence, and for once, everyone complied. Richard leaned back again, but this time the movement was not about distance. It was about perspective. His eyes lifted once more to meet Angela's, and though nothing had been formally resolved, something essential had already changed. The man who had spoken first no longer held the final word, and the woman he had dismissed now defined the silence that followed. The realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a shadow stretching across the table, touching each person in turn. Richard sat there, still, his gaze fixed on Angela, but now there was no attempt to interrupt, no effort to redirect. The instinct to control had not disappeared, but it no longer had a place to stand. Around him, the others had begun to shift in ways that were subtle, but irreversible. One of the senior partners turned his body slightly toward Angela, not dramatically, just enough to signal alignment. Another adjusted his notes, but instead of looking to Richard for confirmation, he glanced toward her, waiting, measuring. The center of gravity had moved, and everyone in the room felt it. Angela did not step forward to claim it. She simply existed within it, calm, grounded, allowing the shift to complete itself without force. The document remained on the table, but it was no longer the source of tension. It had become proof of something already understood, a foundation that could not be ignored. Richard's voice came again, quieter now, stripped of performance, carrying none of the sharp edges from before. "If you are choosing whether to remain," he said slowly, each word deliberate, "then we should discuss terms that reflect that position." It was not an apology. Not yet. But it was the first step away from denial. The first acknowledgement that the structure had changed. Angela held his gaze for a moment, her expression steady, then shifted her attention briefly across the others, acknowledging the room as a whole, not just the man who had once defined it. "Terms were already established," she said. "What is being decided now is not the agreement. It is the direction." The distinction settled heavily. A few heads nodded, understanding immediately. This was no longer about negotiating numbers. It was about leadership, about trust, about who would shape what came next. Richard exhaled slowly, leaning forward again, but this time the movement carried none of the earlier dominance. It was careful, almost restrained, as if he were aware that every gesture now held meaning beyond itself. "And what direction do you see?" he asked. The question was genuine. For the first time, it did not carry an expectation. It carried uncertainty. Angela paused, not because she needed time, but because the moment required space. The city lights behind her shimmered faintly against the glass, reflecting across the table, across the faces now fully turned toward her. "One," where decisions are made with full understanding, she said, her voice even, not assumptions. She let that settle before continuing. One where presence is not mistaken for permission to be dismissed. The words were not directed at him alone, but they landed there first. Richard's expression tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition of the truth he had not acknowledged earlier. Around the table, no one challenged her. No one softened it, because they had all seen it happen. Angela stepped back just slightly, not retreating, but allowing the room to absorb what had been said. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not tense. It was reflective, the kind of silence that comes after something undeniable has been spoken. Richard lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, meeting hers without deflection. And in that moment, without announcement, without ceremony, the balance was no longer shifting. It had settled. No one rushed to fill the silence. It held, steady and complete, like the final note of a song that no one wanted to interrupt too soon. Richard remained seated, his posture no longer rigid, no longer performative, but grounded in something quieter, something closer to honesty than authority. His gaze did not wander this time. It stayed on Angela, not searching for weakness, not calculating leverage, but acknowledging presence. The room watched, not with tension, but with a kind of still attention that had replaced the earlier hierarchy. No one was waiting for dominance anymore. They were waiting for truth. Richard drew a slow breath, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than habit, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the sharpness from before. "I misjudged you," he said. The words were simple, almost understated, but they did not disappear into the room. They settled, clear and direct, without defense, without condition. A few people shifted slightly, not out of discomfort, but because something had finally resolved. The imbalance that had defined the evening had been named. Angela did not respond immediately. She held the moment, not to prolong it, but to let it exist fully, without interruption. Her expression remained calm, unchanged, as if the acknowledgement, while necessary, was not something she had been waiting for. "You did," she replied, her tone even, not dismissive, not accepting, simply factual. There was no triumph in it, no correction, just truth. Richard nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried more weight than anything he had done earlier that night. He glanced briefly at the document still resting on the table, then back at her, as if aligning the reality in front of him with the understanding now forming behind his eyes. "That was my mistake," he added, quieter this time. The words were not offered to regain control. They were offered because there was nothing else left to hold on to. Around the table, no one interrupted. No one reframed it. Because there was nothing to negotiate in that moment. Angela shifted her hand from the table, letting it fall naturally to her side, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. She did not step forward to accept the apology. She did not step back to distance herself from it. She simply remained where she was, grounded in the space she had always occupied, whether others recognized it or not. "What matters now," she said after a brief pause, "is what happens next." The words were not a dismissal of the past, but a redirection of focus, a quiet reminder that acknowledgement alone did not shape outcomes. Richard listened without interruption. That alone was a shift, a real one. The others at the table followed suit, their attention no longer divided, no longer filtered through hierarchy. Angela's voice did not rise, but it carried with clarity that reached every corner of the room. "This partnership does not move forward on assumption," she continued. "It moves forward on clarity, on respect, on understanding who is at the table and why." Each word settled with intention, not force, but certainty. Richard nodded again, slower this time, not as a reflex, but as agreement. Not performative, real. The tension that had defined the evening did not disappear, but it transformed, becoming something more constructive, more grounded, less reactive. Angela turned slightly, her gaze moving across the others, acknowledging them as part of what would come next, not as witnesses to what had already passed. The room, once divided by perception, now felt aligned by something quieter, something earned. And in that alignment, the moment was no longer about correction. It was about direction. And for the first time that evening, everyone understood exactly where that direction would begin. The room did not return to what it had been. It could not. The candles still burned low, their light softer now, reflecting across glasses that had gone untouched for too long. Outside, the city continued its quiet rhythm, headlights drifting along distant streets, unaware that inside this room, something fundamental had shifted. Angela stood for a moment longer, not to hold attention, but to allow the moment to settle fully, to let every person present understand that what had changed was not temporary. It was structural. Then, without announcement, she reached for her chair. The movement was simple, unhurried, but it carried weight. She pulled it back just enough and took her seat, not at the edge, not as a guest, but as someone who had always belonged there. No one questioned it. No one redirected it. Across from her, Richard watched the motion carefully, his expression no longer guarded, no longer distant. He gave a slight nod, not as permission, but as acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance of what was already clear. The others followed the shift instinctively. A man to her left adjusted his papers, turning them slightly in her direction. Another leaned in, his posture open, attentive, no longer angled toward Richard as the default center. The structure of the table had changed without a word. Conversation did not resume immediately. It rebuilt itself slowly, carefully, as if everyone understood that the tone had to match the moment. One of the partners spoke first, his voice measured, respectful. "We should revisit the projections with full alignment," he said, glancing toward Angela as he spoke, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. She gave a small nod, her response minimal but clear, signaling agreement without overtaking the flow. Richard remained quiet for a few seconds longer, then reached for the document once more, not to challenge it, but to place it at the center of the table. The gesture was subtle, but it carried intention. He was no longer holding it apart. He was bringing it into the shared space. His voice, when it returned, was steady, grounded. "We move forward with clarity," he said. "No embellishment. No authority layered over it. Just alignment." Angela's gaze met his briefly, and for the first time, there was no tension in it, no distance, only understanding. Not agreement in everything,